The shrimp was still sizzling in the pan when Roxana Vanderzee pushed open the front door of her lakeside Wisconsin home just after 8 p.m. on September 23, 2003, expecting to find her husband of 8 weeks waiting for dinner. But instead, she found David Vanderzee face down in a pool of his own blood, 5 bullets fired execution style into the back of his head at point-blank range. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Oh my God, he's been shot!" She screamed into her cell phone to 911 dispatch, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine terror. But here's what's absolutely chilling about that call. She immediately knew he'd been shot, even though from where she stood at the doorway, all she could see was her 47-year-old Navy veteran husband lying motionless on the living room floor. How did she know? The dispatcher asked her to check if David was breathing, to see if there were any signs of life, but Roxana refused to get close to the body, claimed she was too scared, too traumatized. Yet somehow she was certain beyond any doubt that her new husband had been murdered by gunfire, when anyone else walking into that scene might have thought he'd collapsed, had a heart attack, suffered a stroke, any number of medical emergencies that could fell a middle-aged man on a Tuesday evening in small-town Wisconsin. The town of Randall sits quiet along the shores of Powers Lake in Kenosha County, the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked and neighbors know each other's business, where a violent crime like this should have been impossible, unthinkable. But David Vanderzee wasn't exactly beloved in this tight-knit community. He was known as hot-headed, controlling, not well-liked by his neighbors, the kind of guy who had money problems and made enemies easily. When Kenosha County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene that night, they found no signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle, no evidence of robbery, despite David having cash and valuables visible throughout the house. The front door was unlocked. Dinner was half prepared on the stove. Everything suggested that David knew his killer, that he'd welcome them into his home without fear or suspicion. The crime scene told a story of calculated murder, professional execution. David had been shot 5 times in the back of the head, with what ballistics would later determine was likely a .38 Special or .357 Magnum revolver. The kind of precise, cold-blooded killing that spoke of intimate betrayal rather than random violence. Someone who knew David's routines, knew when he'd be alone, knew exactly how to get close enough to end his life without giving him a chance to fight back. But who would want David Vanderzee dead? The investigation that followed would reveal a web of lies, secret affairs, financial motives, and betrayal so shocking that it would take more than 2 decades and the intervention of a national television show to finally bring the truth to light. And when that truth emerged in May of 2025, it would rock this quiet Wisconsin community to its core. David Allen Vanderzee was born on April 7th, 1956 in Burlington, Wisconsin. To Alan and Geraldine Kukul Vanderzee, he grew up in a working-class family, joined the United States Navy, where he served with distinction for nearly 20 years, earning decorations and the respect of his fellow servicemen before a back injury forced him into early retirement on disability, leaving him bitter about the premature end to his military career. After his discharge, David returned to Wisconsin, where he worked as a truck driver until his back problems made that impossible too. By 2003, he was living on disability payments and growing increasingly isolated in his lakeside home. His first marriage had ended in divorce. He had no children, few friends, and a reputation in the community as someone you didn't want to cross. David was described by those who knew him as paranoid, controlling, obsessive about money and security, the kind of man who kept detailed records of every penny spent, who installed multiple locks on his doors and was suspicious of everyone's motives. But he was also lonely, desperately seeking companionship in his middle age, which is how he ended up meeting Roxana online in the year 2000. Roxana was a 45-year-old divorced mother living in Illinois when she first connected with David through an internet dating site. They conducted a long-distance relationship for 3 years before David proposed. And on July 26, 2003, just 8 weeks before his murder, they were married in a small ceremony. She moved into his Powers Lake home, and David seemed finally to have found the companionship he'd been seeking. But the marriage was already showing signs of strain by September. Neighbors would later tell investigators that David remained as controlling as ever, monitoring Roxana's spending, questioning her whereabouts, creating tension in what should have been their honeymoon period. And there were whispers in the community about Roxana's relationship with one of David's few close friends, John Viscokel, known locally as Limo John, for his small transportation business, was one of the only people David trusted, a neighbor who lived less than a mile away across Powers Lake, someone David considered his best friend. But residents of the tight-knit community had begun to notice how much time Roxana and John were spending together, how they seemed unusually comfortable with each other, how they would talk and laugh in ways that seemed inappropriate for a new bride and her husband's best friend. On the evening of September 23, 2003, Roxana told investigators she left work at 5:45 p.m. and went shopping in Gurnee, Illinois, about 30 minutes from their home. She had receipts showing purchases at various stores, a seemingly solid alibi that placed her far from the scene when David was murdered. But the timeline would prove to be crucial to understanding what really happened that night. David's last known contact with the outside world was a phone call from Roxana at 6:43 p.m. She claimed she was calling to let him know she was finishing up her shopping and would be home soon. The call lasted several minutes, and when it ended, David went back to preparing dinner. The steak was fully cooked, the shrimp were nearly done. He was putting the finishing touches on what should have been a nice meal for his wife of 2 months. Sometime between 6:43 p.m. when Roxana called him and 8:20 p.m. when she discovered his body, someone David knew and trusted entered that house, walked up behind him while he was cooking, and fired 5 bullets into the back of his head, execution style, then calmly walked away, leaving no trace, no witnesses, no evidence, except for the shell casings and a dead body. The killer had to be someone David would never suspect. Someone he'd turn his back on without fear, someone who knew his routines and could predict when he'd be alone and vulnerable. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, where strangers stood out like sore thumbs, this had to be an inside job. But proving it would be another matter entirely. When detectives interviewed Roxana that night, she seemed appropriately shocked and grief-stricken. She told them about her shopping trip, showed them her receipts, explained that she'd been trying to buy things for their new home together. She had no idea who might want to hurt David, couldn't think of anyone who would do such a horrible thing. But experienced investigators noticed something unusual in her demeanor. For a woman who'd just found her husband of 8 weeks brutally murdered, Roxana seemed remarkably composed. She wasn't hysterical, wasn't falling apart, wasn't displaying the kind of overwhelming grief you'd expect from a new bride who'd just lost her soulmate. And when detectives offered her a voice stress test, a routine procedure that might help eliminate her as a suspect, she flatly refused. The refusal raised red flags. Innocent people usually welcome the opportunity to clear their names, especially in cases involving the murder of a loved one. But Roxana wanted nothing to do with any kind of testing or additional questioning. She hired a lawyer almost immediately and made it clear she wouldn't be providing any more information than absolutely necessary. Meanwhile, John Viscosil told detectives he'd visited David earlier that afternoon around 2 p.m. They talked about boats and fishing, normal guy conversation. But John claimed he'd gone home after that, covered his boat in preparation for an approaching storm, and then taken it out on Powers Lake for some evening fishing from about 6 until 8 p.m., right during the window when David was murdered. John said he'd been fishing alone, couldn't provide any witnesses to his whereabouts, and when he returned home, he'd immediately put his clothes in the washing machine because he'd fallen into the lake and gotten wet. But his girlfriend at the time, Janie Dunham, would later tell investigators that she didn't remember John coming home wet that night, didn't remember any commotion about wet clothes or needing to clean up a mess. The timeline was suspicious. John claimed he'd been out on the water during the exact time frame when David was killed, just a few hundred yards from the victim's house, close enough to motor across the lake, commit murder, and return home within minutes. But proving that theory would require more than just suspicion. For 21 years, the David Vanderzee murder case remained officially unsolved. Despite intensive investigation, despite following every lead, despite the obvious connections between the victim, his new wife, and his best friend, detectives couldn't gather enough evidence to charge anyone with the crime. The case went cold, and the people of Powers Lake began to accept that David's killer would never be brought to justice. But cold cases have a way of staying alive in the hearts and minds of families who've lost loved ones. David's mother spent years bringing homemade baked goods to the Kenosha County Sheriff's Office, making sure detectives never forgot about her son, never stopped looking for answers, never gave up hope that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge and justice would finally be served. In early 2025, the producers of Oxygen Network's hit true crime series Cold Justice reached out to Kenosha County authorities about revisiting the Vanderzee case. The show, hosted by veteran prosecutor Kelly Siegler and a team of experienced investigators, had helped solve dozens of cold cases across America, bringing fresh eyes and new techniques to old mysteries. Kelly Siegler built her reputation as one of the toughest prosecutors in Texas, with over 200 jury trials under her belt and a track record of winning even the most difficult cases. She'd left the district attorney's office to dedicate herself to cold justice, traveling the country to help local law enforcement solve their most challenging unsolved murders. When the cold justice team arrived in Kenosha County in early 2025, they brought with them advanced investigative techniques, fresh perspectives, and most importantly, the ability to look at the case without the emotional baggage that had accumulated over 2 decades of frustration and dead ends. What they found would shock even seasoned investigators who thought they'd seen everything, because the truth about what happened to David Vanderzee on that September night in 2003 was more twisted, more calculating, and more heartlessly cruel than anyone had imagined, and it had been hiding in plain sight for over 20 years. Part 1 of this story ends with a question that would haunt investigators for decades. How do you prove murder when the killers are smart enough to create perfect alibis, cold enough to execute their plan flawlessly, and ruthless enough to live with their secret for over 2 decades, while the victims' families suffered without answers? The answer would come from an unexpected source, and when it did, it would finally bring justice to David Vanderzee and expose the shocking truth about the people he trusted most. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning after David Vanderzee's murder, while crime scene investigators were still processing evidence and detectives were conducting their first round of interviews, something happened that should have sent alarm bells ringing through the entire investigation, but somehow got overlooked in the chaos of those early hours. Roxana Vanderzee moved out of the house where her husband of 8 weeks had just been brutally executed, and she didn't move in with family, didn't check into a hotel, didn't seek comfort from female friends or relatives. Instead, she moved directly into the home of John Viscasil, her dead husband's best friend. In any murder investigation, when the victim's spouse immediately shacks up with someone else, especially someone close to the victim, competent detectives take notice. They ask questions. They dig deeper. They recognize that people don't usually jump from grief to new living arrangements in less than 24 hours unless something very suspicious is going on. But in the Van der Zee case, this critical detail somehow didn't trigger the intensive scrutiny it deserved. Roxana claimed she was too traumatized to stay in the house where David died, said she needed comfort and support from someone who understood her loss, someone who'd also cared about David. But the residents of Powers Lake saw something entirely different. They saw a woman who seemed remarkably unaffected by her husband's violent death, who displayed no visible grief, no signs of the emotional devastation you'd expect from a new bride who'd just discovered her soulmate's corpse. John Viscasil, meanwhile, played the role of the grieving best friend perfectly. He told anyone who would listen how shocked he was by David's death, how he couldn't imagine who would do such a terrible thing to such a good man, how he was only trying to help Roxana through this difficult time because that's what David would have wanted him to do. But longtime residents of the community weren't buying it. Janie Dunham, John's girlfriend of several years, was devastated not just by David's murder, but by watching the man she loved suddenly become so devoted to comforting David's widow. She'd noticed changes in John's behavior over the past few months, times when he seemed distracted, secretive, unavailable. And now she was watching him shower attention and care on another woman while claiming it was all about friendship and grief. The day after David's funeral, Janie made a discovery that would haunt her for the next 22 years. She woke up in John's house to find him on the couch holding hands with Roxana, the two of them sitting close together in a way that had nothing to do with grief counseling and everything to do with romantic intimacy. When she confronted John about what she'd seen, he claimed it was innocent, that Roxana was just scared and needed comfort. But Janie knew better. Within weeks of David's murder, John Viscosil and Roxana Van der Zee were living together openly as a couple. They made no attempt to hide their relationship, showed no awareness that their behavior might seem suspicious or inappropriate, acted like two people who'd found love in the aftermath of tragedy rather than two people who might have created that tragedy themselves. For the neighbors who'd known David, John and Roxana before the murder, this rapid transition from friendship to romance was deeply disturbing. They remembered seeing John and Roxana together during the brief period of David and Roxana's marriage, remembered thinking their interactions seemed too familiar, too comfortable, too intimate for a new bride and her husband's best friend. Mary Patterson, who lived 3 houses down from David, later told investigators she'd seen John and Roxana together on multiple occasions when David wasn't around, sometimes sitting in John's truck talking for long periods, sometimes walking together along the lake shore, sometimes meeting at the local diner when David was supposedly at home. She'd thought it was odd at the time, but hadn't wanted to gossip or cause trouble in what seemed like a happy new marriage. Now, watching John and Roxana together as a couple just weeks after David's funeral, Mary realized she'd been witnessing an affair, not innocent friendship. And she wasn't the only community member reaching that conclusion. The whispers started almost immediately after the funeral. Quiet conversations about timing and behavior, and the suspicious speed with which David's widow had moved on with his best friend. But whispers and suspicions don't solve murder cases. Detectives needed evidence, and in 2003, the forensic tools available to investigators were limited compared to what we have today. There was no usable DNA evidence from the crime scene, no fingerprints on the shell casings, no surveillance cameras to provide visual confirmation of who was where and when. Solving this case would require old-fashioned police work, patient investigation, and careful analysis of witness statements and circumstantial evidence. Detective Sergeant Neil Paulson of the Kenosha County Sheriff's Office was the lead investigator assigned to the Van der Zee case. He was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement with experience in dozens of homicide investigations. And from the very beginning, he had serious suspicions about both Roxana and John. But suspicions don't equal evidence, and evidence was exactly what he was lacking. Paulson knew that most murders are committed by someone close to the victim, a spouse, a relative, a friend, someone with intimate access and personal knowledge of the victim's habits and routines. In David's case, the circle of people with that level of access was extremely small. David was a loner, distrustful of most people, someone who kept his social circle tight and his personal business private. The detective also knew that staged crime scenes, murders designed to look like home invasions or random violence, usually fall apart under careful scrutiny. But the Van der Zee crime scene was puzzling because it hadn't been staged at all. Whoever killed David made no attempt to make it look like a robbery or break-in. They'd simply executed him and left, which suggested either supreme confidence in their ability to avoid detection or supreme stupidity about how murder investigations work. When Paulson interviewed John Viscasil in detail about his activities on the night of September 23rd, he found the man's story problematic on several levels. John claimed he'd visited David around 2 p.m., which was confirmed by David's neighbor, who saw John's distinctive pickup truck in the driveway. But John's account of the rest of his evening raised red flags for an experienced investigator. According to John, he'd left David's house around 3 p.m., gone home to cover his boat because of approaching weather, then decided to go fishing on Powers Lake from approximately 6 p.m. until 8 p.m. During this alleged fishing trip, he claimed to have fallen into the lake and gotten completely soaked, which explained why he'd immediately put his clothes in the washing machine when he returned home. But here's what bothered Detective Paulson about that story. John was an experienced fisherman who'd lived on Powers Lake for years. He knew the water, knew his boat, knew how to handle himself around the lake even in challenging conditions. Accidental falls would be unusual for someone with his experience, and the timing was suspiciously convenient. If John's story was true, he'd been out on the water alone and without witnesses during the exact window when David was murdered, and his house was directly across the lake from David's house, less than a quarter mile by water, a distance that could be covered in minutes by someone familiar with the lake and operating a small motorboat. More troubling was John's explanation for why he'd put his clothes directly into the washing machine. If he'd simply fallen into the lake, most people would hang wet clothes up to dry, especially if they weren't particularly dirty, but John claimed he'd immediately wash them, destroying any potential evidence that might have been on the clothing. When Detective Paulson interviewed Janie Dunham, John's girlfriend, he found inconsistencies in her account of that evening that raised even more questions. Janie initially supported John's story, confirmed that he'd gone fishing and returned home wet. But as the interview progressed and Paulson pressed for details, Janie began to seem less certain about her memories. She couldn't remember John making a big fuss about being wet, couldn't recall him dripping water on the floor or leaving a trail of wet footprints, couldn't point to specific evidence that he'd actually fallen into the lake beyond his claim that he had. For someone who'd supposedly witnessed her boyfriend's dramatic tumble into Powers Lake, Janie's recollections were remarkably vague and uncertain. But the most damning evidence against John and Roxana wasn't what they did on the night of the murder. It was what they did in the months and weeks leading up to it, because phone records obtained by investigators revealed a pattern of communication between John and Roxana that painted a very different picture of their relationship than the one they'd presented to authorities. On September 23rd, 2003, the day David was murdered, John Viscasil and Roxana Van der Zee exchanged multiple phone calls starting at 7:46 a.m. and continuing throughout the day. They talked for extended periods, much longer than you'd expect between casual acquaintances, and the timing of their final calls was particularly suspicious. At 6:43 p.m., Roxana called David at home, the last conversation he would ever have. The call lasted several minutes, and according to Roxana, she was telling David she was finishing her shopping and would be home soon. But just 3 minutes later, at 6:46 p.m., Roxana called John, and they talked for another extended period. At 7:36 p.m., Roxana called John's house again and spoke with Janie Dunham, supposedly asking if John was available. But according to phone records, John wasn't home. He was allegedly out on his boat fishing alone. So why would Roxana be looking for him at that particular time? And why would she need to speak with him so urgently on the night her husband was murdered? The most chilling call came at 8:11 p.m., just 9 minutes before Roxana called 911 to report finding David's body. John called Roxana's cell phone and they spoke briefly. Detective Jason Sielski, who would later work with the Cold Justice team, characterized this as the "it's done" call, the communication between conspirators confirming that their plan had been successfully executed. But even with suspicious phone records, questionable alibis, and a community full of witnesses who'd observed John and Roxana's inappropriately close relationship, Detective Paulson knew he didn't have enough evidence to charge either suspect with murder. Circumstantial evidence can be powerful, but it needs to be overwhelming to convince a jury, and in 2003, the Van der Zee case was frustrating rather than overwhelming. The investigation continued for months. Paulson interviewed dozens of potential witnesses, analyzed every piece of physical evidence, consulted with prosecutors about the strength of his case, but everywhere he turned, he found the same problem. John and Roxana were clearly the most likely suspects, but proving their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt remained elusive. Part of the problem was that both suspects were smart enough to lawyer up immediately and stop cooperating with the investigation. They refused polygraph tests, declined to provide additional statements, made it clear through their attorneys that they had nothing more to say about David's murder or their relationship, which was their legal right, but made detective work infinitely more difficult. The case gradually went cold, not because investigators gave up, but because they'd exhausted every lead, interviewed every potential witness, analyzed every piece of evidence, and still couldn't build a case strong enough to take to court. Detective Paulson moved on to other cases, but he never forgot about David Van der Zee, never stopped hoping that someday new evidence would emerge or technology would advance enough to finally solve the puzzle. Meanwhile, John Viscasil and Roxana Van der Zee continued living their lives as a couple. They eventually married, though the exact date of their wedding was kept quiet, probably to avoid further speculation about their role in David's death. They lived openly in the Powers Lake community where David had been murdered, seemingly unconcerned about lingering suspicions or ongoing investigation. For the residents of Powers Lake, watching John and Roxana live happily together while David's murder remained unsolved was a constant reminder of the injustice. Many people believed they knew exactly who had killed David Van der Zee and why. But belief isn't evidence, and evidence was what the case had always lacked. Years passed. Then decades, the original investigators retired. New detectives took over cold cases, technology advanced. But the Van der Zee file remained frustratingly incomplete, full of suspicions and theories, but lacking the definitive proof needed to finally close the case and bring David's killers to justice. David's family never gave up hope. His mother continued her regular visits to the sheriff's office, her homemade cookies and persistent questions serving as constant reminders that someone had gotten away with murder, that a good man's death remained unavenged, that somewhere in Kenosha County, killers were living free while their victim lay in his grave. By 2025, most people assumed the Van der Zee case would never be solved, that too much time had passed, that the evidence had gone cold, that the perpetrators would escape earthly justice even if they couldn't escape their own consciences. But sometimes, the most frustrating cold cases are the ones that eventually yield the most satisfying solutions. And David Van der Zee's case was about to prove that patience. Persistence and fresh eyes can accomplish what decades of traditional investigation could not. When the Cold Justice production team reached out to the Kenosha County Sheriff's Office in early 2025 about revisiting the David Van der Zee murder case, Sheriff David Zorner didn't hesitate to accept their help. The case had haunted his department for over 2 decades, and he knew that sometimes fresh eyes and national resources could accomplish what local investigators simply couldn't manage with limited time and budget constraints. Kelly Siegler arrived in Kenosha County like a force of nature. The veteran Texas prosecutor had built her reputation on her ability to see patterns and connections that others missed, to extract confessions from hardened criminals, and to present complex circumstantial evidence in ways that convinced even skeptical juries. She'd tried approximately 200 jury trials during her 21 years as a Harris County prosecutor, and she brought that courtroom experience to every cold case she investigated. Siegler was joined by homicide investigator Steve Spingola, a Wisconsin native who understood the culture and mindset of small-town communities like Powers Lake. Spingola had spent decades investigating murders in Milwaukee before joining the cold justice team, and his experience with Wisconsin criminals and crime scenes would prove invaluable in understanding the dynamics of the Vanderzee case. The cold justice team always began their investigations the same way, by completely re-examining the original case file, reading every witness statement, studying every piece of evidence, looking for connections and patterns that might have been missed during the original investigation and in the Vanderzee case. They immediately focused on the two most obvious suspects who'd somehow avoided prosecution for over 20 years. From all accounts, David was known as kind of a jerk. He was kind of hot-headed, so he was not well-liked in the neighborhood. Lieutenant Neil Paulson explained to Siegler and Spingola as he laid out the original case details. He had a lot of money issues, but David did not have very many friends, so only a few people were ever welcome in his house. This was crucial information for experienced investigators, because it meant the universe of potential suspects was extremely small. David wasn't the kind of person who opened his door to strangers or welcomed unexpected visitors. Whoever killed him had to be someone he trusted completely, someone he'd turn his back on without fear, someone with intimate knowledge of his routines and habits. Siegler immediately seized on a detail that had bothered original investigators but had never been fully explored. Roxana's behavior on the 911 call, specifically her immediate certainty that David had been shot when she could have had no way of knowing the cause of his condition from her position at the doorway. She said he'd been shot before. She even got close to the body. Siegler noted, "That's not normal. Most people finding someone unconscious on the floor would think of a medical emergency first, not murder, unless they already knew what had happened." The cold justice team also focused intensively on the timeline, using phone records to create a minute-by-minute reconstruction of September 23rd, 2003. And what they found was a pattern of communication between Roxana and John that looked less like coincidence and more like coordination. Starting at 7:46 a.m. on the morning of the murder, Roxana and John exchanged multiple calls throughout the day, far more communication than you'd expect between a new bride and her husband's friend. And the timing of these calls suggested they were coordinating activities, sharing information, possibly finalizing plans. At 6:43 p.m., Roxana called David at home, establishing that he was alive and at the house. Just 3 minutes later, she called John, possibly providing confirmation that David was in position and alone. Then at 7:36 p.m., she called John's house looking for him, even though he claimed to be fishing alone on the lake. But the most damning call came at 8:11 p.m., just 9 minutes before Roxana's 911 call reporting the discovery of David's body. John called Roxana's cell phone for what investigators now believed was confirmation that the murder had been completed successfully. "This is the it's done call," Detective Jason Selsky told the cold justice team. "The timing is too perfect to be coincidence. Ziegler and Spingola also paid careful attention to John's alibi, his claim that he'd been fishing alone on Powers Lake during the time window when David was murdered. They visited the lake, studied the geography, timed how long it would take to motor across the water from John's house to David's house, and concluded that the alleged fishing trip provided perfect cover for committing the murder. If John wanted to get to David's house without being seen by road traffic or neighbors, the fastest and most discreet route would be straight across the lake, Spingola observed. He could make that trip in under 5 minutes each way. Plenty of time to commit the murder and return home. The Cold Justice team also examined John's explanation for why he'd immediately put his wet clothes in the washing machine after his supposed fall into the lake. Experienced investigators know that guilty suspects often over-explain innocent actions, and John's detailed story about getting wet and needing to avoid dripping water seemed suspiciously elaborate. More significantly, when they interviewed Janie Dunham, John's girlfriend from 2003, she provided information that contradicted John's account of that evening, information that had somehow been overlooked or undervalued during the original investigation. Janie told Ziegler and Spingola that John's solo fishing trip was completely out of character. He was an experienced angler who usually fished with buddies or during optimal conditions, not alone during threatening weather in the evening. She also couldn't recall him coming home particularly wet or making any fuss about falling into the lake, but most damaging was Janie's recollection of John and Roxana's relationship during the weeks leading up to David's murder. She'd noticed them spending increasing amounts of time together, talking on the phone constantly, displaying a level of intimacy that seemed inappropriate for a married woman and her husband's best friend. They were clearly having an affair, Janie told the Cold Justice team. I could see it in how they looked at each other, how comfortable they were together, how they'd find excuses to be alone. John was different around her, more attentive, more romantic. He was treating her like a girlfriend, not like his buddy's wife. Janie also revealed details about the night after David's murder that painted a disturbing picture of John and Roxana's behavior. She'd allowed Roxana to spend the night at John's house because the woman claimed to be too traumatized to be alone. But Janie woke up to find John and Roxana holding hands on the couch, a level of physical intimacy that had nothing to do with grief counseling. When I saw them together like that, I knew, Janie said. I knew they'd been lying about their relationship, knew they'd been together long before David died. And I started wondering if maybe they'd done something to make sure David was out of the picture permanently. Armed with this fresh testimony from Janie Dunham, along with their analysis of the phone records and timeline, the Cold Justice team felt they were finally building a case strong enough to present to prosecutors, but they needed one more element, a confrontation with the suspects themselves. Kelly Ziegler had learned during her decades as a prosecutor that guilty people often revealed themselves when confronted directly with evidence of their crimes. They might not confess outright, but their reactions, their body language, their attempts to explain away damaging evidence often provided the final pieces of the puzzle. In May of 2025, more than 21 years after David Vanderzee's murder, Ziegler and Spingola decided to interview John Viscasil and Roxana Vanderzee Collins separately, hoping that one of them might finally crack under pressure or that their stories might contradict each other in ways that revealed their guilt. John Viscasil, now 70 years old, still lived in the same house across the lake from where David had been murdered. He was no longer married to Roxana. Their relationship had ended years earlier, possibly under the strain of living with their shared secret. When investigators knocked on his door, he agreed to talk, perhaps believing he could charm his way through another interview just as he had for over 2 decades. But John hadn't counted on facing Kelly Ziegler, a prosecutor who'd spent her career getting confessions from killers who thought they were smarter than the justice system. Ziegler laid out the evidence methodically, the phone records showing constant communication between John and Roxana on the day of the murder, The suspicious timing of the calls, John's implausible fishing story, his immediate destruction of potentially incriminating clothing. John stuck to his original story, denied any romantic involvement with Roxana before David's death, insisted his fishing trip was legitimate and his fall into the lake was accidental. But Siegler could see the strain in his face. The way his answers became more elaborate and less convincing as the interview progressed. John was lying. And he knew that I knew he was lying, Siegler said later. But he'd been living with this lie for so long that he couldn't abandon it now. Even when it was obviously falling apart, the interview with Roxana Vanderzee Collins was even more revealing. She was also 70 years old now, living in McHenry, Illinois. And she seemed shocked that investigators were still pursuing the case after all these years. She'd apparently convinced herself that enough time had passed for her to be safe from prosecution. When Siegler confronted Roxana with the theory that she and John had conspired to murder David, that John had pulled the trigger while she provided the alibi and inside information, Roxana's reaction was telling. Instead of expressing outrage or demanding to know how anyone could suggest such a horrible thing, she simply looked away with a blank expression and walked into her house without saying a word. "Innocent people don't react that way," Spingola observed. "Innocent people get angry. They defend themselves. They demand explanations. They don't just shut down and walk away when accused of murder." But the most compelling evidence came from re-examining the physical evidence with modern investigative techniques. Ballistics experts determined that David had been shot with a .38 Special or .357 Magnum revolver, and investigators discovered that John Viscosil had owned multiple firearms of both calibers, weapons that had been searched and tested in 2003 but never definitively linked to the murder. More significantly, the Cold Justice team's reconstruction of the crime scene suggested that David had been shot within seconds of the killer's arrival. There were no signs of conversation or confrontation, no indication that David had time to react or defend himself, suggesting that whoever killed him had approached from behind and fired immediately. David was putting the finishing touches on dinner when he was killed, Siegler noted. The shrimp was still cooking, the steak was done. He was in the final stages of meal preparation, which means the killer knew exactly when to arrive for maximum effectiveness. This level of precision suggested intimate knowledge of David's routines, knowledge that would have come from someone very close to him, someone who understood his habits and could predict his behavior with confidence. And there were only two people in David's life with that level of access, his wife and his best friend. By the end of their investigation, the Cold Justice team felt confident they'd solved the David Vanderzee murder case. They'd identified the killers, understood their motive, reconstructed their method, and gathered enough evidence to support criminal charges. But the final decision would rest with Kenosha County District Attorney Xavier Solis. Solis had campaigned on a platform of restoring public trust in the justice system and aggressively pursuing unresolved crimes. The Vanderzee case represented exactly the kind of challenge he'd promised to tackle. But he also knew that prosecuting a 21-year-old murder case based primarily on circumstantial evidence would be risky and expensive. After reviewing the Cold Justice team's findings, consulting with his staff, and carefully weighing the strength of the evidence, District Attorney Solis made the decision that David Vanderzee's family had been waiting over 2 decades to hear. He would authorize criminal charges against John Viscosil and Roxana Vanderzee Collins for first-degree intentional homicide. On May 28, 2025, in the final moments of the Cold Justice episode titled Newlywed Nightmare, Kelly Siegler received the call she'd been hoping for. Arrest warrants had been signed, and after 21 years of freedom, David Vanderzee's killers were finally going to face justice. The arrests would shock the Powers Lake community, not because people were surprised by the identities of the suspects, but because they'd given up hope that justice would ever be served. For over 2 decades, John Viscasil and Roxana Vanderzee Collins had lived freely while David Vanderzee lay in his grave. But their time was finally up. At dawn on Wednesday, May 28, 2025, multiple law enforcement agencies across 2 states executed coordinated arrest warrants that would finally bring justice to David Vanderzee, more than 21 years after his execution-style murder. The simultaneous arrests of John Viscasil in Wisconsin and Roxana Collins in Illinois marked the end of one of the longest-running cold cases in Kenosha County history and sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Powers. Lake John Joseph Viscasil, now 70 years old, was taken into custody at his home on 402nd Avenue in Genoa City, Wisconsin, less than a mile from the lakeside house where David Vanderzee had been murdered. Officers from the Kenosha County Sheriff's Office arrived at 6 a.m. with an arrest warrant charging him with first-degree intentional homicide as a party to a crime with use of a dangerous weapon, a charge that carried the possibility of life in prison. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as the man they'd known for decades as Limo John was led away in handcuffs. His transportation business had made him a familiar figure in the community, someone who'd provided rides to weddings and special events, someone who'd seemed like a harmless, if somewhat rough around the edges, local character. The idea that he might be a cold-blooded killer was difficult for many residents to process. Simultaneously, 200 miles away in McHenry, Illinois, 70-year-old Roxana Lynn Collins, formerly Roxana Vanderzee, was being arrested at her home on Evergreen Circle by officers from the McHenry County Sheriff's Office acting on a warrant from Kenosha County. She faced identical charges to John's, and like him, she would be looking at the possibility of spending the rest of her life behind bars. The timing of the arrests was no coincidence. Law enforcement officials knew that if they arrested one suspect first, that person might warn the other, or both suspects might destroy evidence or flee. By executing the warrants simultaneously in the early morning hours, they ensured that neither John nor Roxana could interfere with the others. Commissioner William Michel II had signed the arrest warrants after District Attorney Xavier Solis personally authorized the charges. Solis had run for office, promising to tackle cold cases and restore public confidence in the justice system. And the Vanderzee case represented exactly the kind of challenge he'd committed to addressing. Despite the risks involved in prosecuting a decades-old murder case based largely on circumstantial evidence, John Viscasil's bond was initially set at $100,000 cash, but prosecutors quickly moved to increase it to $500,000, arguing that he represented a flight risk and a danger to the community. At 70 years old, with significant health issues, John posed less of a physical threat than he might have in his younger years. But his ability to live with the secret of David's murder for over 2 decades demonstrated a calculating coldness that concerned authorities. Roxana Collins was initially held on $75,000 cash bond in the McHenry County Jail pending extradition to Wisconsin. Her attorneys immediately began fighting the extradition, hoping to delay her transfer and give themselves more time to prepare a defense. But the evidence against her was so compelling that legal experts predicted the extradition fight would be unsuccessful. The criminal complaints filed against both defendants painted a devastating picture of premeditation, conspiracy, and cold-blooded murder for profit. Prosecutors alleged that Roxana had married David Vanderzee as part of an elaborate scheme to gain access to his assets while conducting an affair with his best friend, and that the 2 conspirators had planned and executed David's murder when their secret relationship threatened to be exposed. According to the complaints, the evidence showed that Roxana and John had been in constant communication on the day of the murder, exchanging calls throughout the day in what appeared to be coordination of their deadly plan. The final call from John to Roxana at 8:11 p.m. just 9 minutes before she called 911 to report finding David's body, was characterized by prosecutors as confirmation that the murder had been completed. The motive for the killing was both financial and romantic. David had accumulated significant assets during his military career and subsequent work, and as his wife, Roxana stood to inherit everything if he died. Meanwhile, her affair with John Viscasil had been ongoing for months, possibly years, and the conspirators saw David's death as the solution to their problem of wanting to be together while gaining access to his wealth. Phone records showed that on September 23rd, 2003, Roxana had called David at 6:43 p.m. to confirm he was home and alone, then immediately called John at 6:46 p.m. Prosecutors argued this was the go signal that told John it was safe to proceed with the murder plan. The timing was so precise that it could not have been coincidental. John's alibi of fishing alone on Powers Lake during the murder window was exposed as a fabrication designed to provide cover for the real activity. Motoring across the lake to David's house, executing the murder and returning home, his claim that he'd fallen into the lake and needed to immediately wash his clothes was revealed as a pre-planned excuse to destroy any physical evidence that might have linked him to the crime scene. The fact that David had been shot 5 times in the back of the head at close range indicated this was an execution, not a crime of passion or self-defense. Someone had approached him from behind while he was cooking dinner and methodically ended his life. The killer had to be someone David trusted completely, someone who could get close without triggering alarm or defensive reactions. Ballistics evidence showed the murder weapon was consistent with firearms that John Viscasil owned at the time of the killing. Though the actual gun was never recovered, investigators theorized that the weapon had been disposed of immediately after the murder, possibly thrown into Powers Lake, where it would be virtually impossible to find after more than 2 decades. Most damning was the behavior of both suspects in the immediate aftermath of David's murder. Instead of maintaining appropriate distance while grieving the loss of a husband and friend, respectively, Roxana and John had moved in together within days of the killing, displaying a level of intimate connection that proved their relationship had existed long before David's. The witness testimony from community members confirmed that Roxana and John had been conducting an affair during David's brief marriage. They'd been seen together at times when David wasn't present, observed having intimate conversations in John's truck, and generally behaving like lovers rather than casual acquaintances. Their post-murder relationship simply made public what had been happening in secret. When news of the arrests broke, the reaction in Powers Lake was a mixture of vindication, relief, and shock. Many residents had suspected John and Roxana for years, but had given up hope that they would ever be held accountable. The fact that justice had finally arrived after more than 2 decades felt almost surreal to people who'd watched the suspects live freely in their community. "I always knew they did it," said Mary Patterson, David's neighbor who'd observed John and Roxana's suspicious behavior before the murder. The way they acted after he died, moving in together so fast, showing no real grief. It was obvious they were involved, but I never thought they'd actually get arrested after all this time. Other community members expressed amazement that the case had finally been solved. The arrest of suspects in a 21-year-old murder was almost unprecedented in their experience, and many credited the Cold Justice television show with accomplishing what decades of local investigation had failed to achieve. Tim Vander Zee, David's brother, expressed relief and gratitude when told about the arrests. "I feel relieved," he said, "after all these years of wondering, of knowing that David's killers were walking free. It's incredible to finally see them facing justice. David deserved better than what happened to him, and our family deserved answers." The arrests also brought closure to David's mother, who had spent over 20 years bringing homemade cookies to the Kenosha County Sheriff's Office and pleading with detectives never to forget her son's case. At 91 years old, she'd lived to see the day she'd almost given up hoping for. The day when her son's killers would finally be held accountable. Kelly, Siegler, and the cold justice team were vindicated in their belief that the case could be solved with fresh eyes and persistent investigation. Their work had not only brought justice to David Vandezee's family, but had also demonstrated that even the oldest cold cases could yield to modern investigative techniques and determined effort. This case shows that justice delayed is not always justice denied, Siegler said after the arrests. David Vandezee waited over 20 years for his killers to be caught, but the truth finally emerged. And now his family can begin to heal, knowing that the people who betrayed and murdered him will face the consequences of their actions, Sheriff. David Zorner praised the collaborative effort between his department, the district attorney's office, and the cold justice team, calling the arrests the result of continued diligent detective work and investigation, which included a fresh review of the case by the Kenosha County District Attorney. This case highlights the significant progress being made in solving long-standing murders through renewed investigative efforts, Zorner said in a statement. We never gave up on finding justice for David Vandezee, and I'm grateful to everyone who worked to make these arrests possible. The legal proceedings moved quickly once extradition issues were resolved. Roxana Collins waived her right to fight extradition and was transferred to the Kenosha County Jail on Friday, May 30th, joining John Viscasil in custody. Both defendants were scheduled for initial appearances in Kenosha County Circuit Court, where they would enter pleas to the charges against them. Legal experts following the case predicted that both defendants would plead not guilty and attempt to challenge the circumstantial evidence against them, but they noted that the prosecution appeared to have built a strong case based on phone records, witness testimony, and the defendant's own suspicious behavior over more than 2 decades. The fact that both suspects were now 70 years old raised questions about their ability to survive lengthy prison sentences if convicted. But prosecutors made clear they would seek maximum penalties regardless of the defendant's age, arguing that the calculated nature of David's murder and the decades of freedom the killers had enjoyed demanded serious consequences. Defense attorneys would likely argue that the case was too old to prosecute effectively, that witnesses' memories had faded, that evidence had been lost or contaminated, and that their clients were being scapegoated for an unsolved murder because the real killer had never been found. But the strength of the circumstantial evidence suggested these arguments would face significant challenges. The community of Powers Lake prepared for what would likely be a lengthy and emotionally difficult trial. Residents who'd known David, John, and Roxana for years would be called to testify about their observations and interactions. The quiet lakeside community would become the focus of intense media attention as reporters covered the prosecution of a murder case that had captivated true crime enthusiasts across the country. As John Viscasil and Roxana Collins sat in their jail cells awaiting trial, they faced the reality that their 21-year run of freedom was over. The elaborate lies they'd constructed to cover their crime were falling apart under scrutiny, and the justice system that had seemed powerless to touch them for over 2 decades was finally closing in with the full weight of the law. In a stunning turn of events that shocked even seasoned legal observers, Roxana Collins posted her $500,000 bail on June 3rd, 2025, just 6 days after being transferred to the Kenosha County Jail, making her a free woman while awaiting trial for the murder of her former husband. The fact that a 70-year-old woman facing life imprisonment for first-degree homicide could secure such a substantial bond raised eyebrows throughout the legal community and infuriated David Vandezee's family members, who'd waited over 2 decades for justice. The bond amount had been set high precisely to keep Collins in custody. Prosecutors had argued that she represented both a flight risk and a danger to potential witnesses. given that she'd successfully evaded prosecution for over 20 years. There was legitimate concern that she might disappear rather than face trial. But Collins apparently had access to financial resources that allowed her to post the $500,000 bond and walk out of jail pending her court proceedings, leaving many to question whether justice was truly being served equally. Meanwhile, John Viscasil remained locked up in the Kenosha County Jail on his own $500,000 bond, which he was unable to post at 70 years old with limited financial resources. He faced the prospect of spending months or possibly years in custody while waiting for his case to proceed through the legal system. The contrast between his situation and Collins's freedom highlighted the role that money plays in determining pre-trial detention. Even in cases involving the most serious crimes, the release of Collins sparked immediate and widespread controversy in the Powers Lake community. Residents who'd waited over 2 decades to see David Vanderzee's killers held accountable were outraged that one of the alleged perpetrators was back on the street so quickly. Many expressed concern about witness intimidation and the possibility that Collins might flee to avoid prosecution, while others questioned whether the justice system had failed David Vanderzee once again. "It's not right," said Mary Patterson, David's former neighbor, who'd witnessed suspicious behavior between Collins and Viscasil before the murder. This woman allegedly executed her husband in cold blood, lived free for 21 years, while his family suffered without answers. And now she's out on bail like it's some minor offense. What kind of message does that send to the community about the value of David's life, about the seriousness of murder? Other community members echoed Patterson's frustration. Longtime resident Robert Chen, who'd known David for years, expressed disbelief that someone accused of such a calculated crime could secure release. "We watched her move in with John the day after David's funeral," Chen said. "We watched them live as a couple while David's body was barely cold in the ground. And now we're supposed to trust that she won't run away to avoid facing the consequences of what she's done." District Attorney Xavier Solis found himself in the difficult position of defending the bail decision, while also trying to reassure a community that felt betrayed by the justice system. He explained that pre-trial detention laws had changed significantly since 2003, and that even defendants facing serious charges had constitutional rights to reasonable bail, unless they posed immediate danger or were certain flight risks. But he acknowledged the community's frustration and promised that his office would seek justice regardless of Collins's pretrial status. "I understand the community's anger," Solis said during a press conference. "David Vanderzee's family and friends have waited over 20 years for justice, and it's frustrating to see one of the defendants walking free while awaiting trial. But we must follow the law and ensure that everyone's constitutional rights are protected, even those accused of the most heinous crimes. Our focus remains on building the strongest possible case to ensure that justice is served in the courtroom." As the legal proceedings move forward through the summer of 2025, both defendants entered pleas of not guilty to the charges against them. Their defense attorneys immediately began challenging the strength of the prosecution's case, arguing that 21 years was too long to expect witnesses to remember events accurately, and that the evidence was purely circumstantial, without any direct proof of their client's involvement. In David's murder, Collins's defense team, led by experienced criminal attorney Robert Morrison, a 30-year veteran of high-profile murder cases, argued that the phone records showing extensive communication between Collins and Viscasil on the day of the murder proved nothing more than friendship. They claimed that two people talking frequently during a day when one of them would later discover her husband's body was not evidence of conspiracy but rather normal human behavior during a time of crisis. Morrison's strategy focused heavily on attacking the timeline, arguing that the prosecution's theory required precise coordination that would have been nearly impossible to execute, especially for two people who'd never committed a violent crime before. He characterized the phone calls as evidence of friendship and support, not criminal conspiracy, and argued that moving in together after the murder was a natural response to grief and trauma, not evidence of guilt. Viscosill's attorney, Sarah Chen, took a different approach, focusing on attacking her client's alleged phishing alibi and arguing that her client's story had remained consistent for over 20 years. She pointed out that there was no direct evidence placing Viscosill at David's house during the time of the murder. No witnesses who saw him cross the lake, no forensic evidence linking him to the crime scene, and no murder weapon connecting him to the killing. Chen's defense strategy relied heavily on the concept of reasonable doubt. She characterized the prosecution's case as speculation based on suspicion rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt, arguing that coincidences and suspicious behavior were not the same as evidence of murder. She planned to present expert testimony about the challenges of memory after decades, the unreliability of circumstantial evidence, and the dangers of prosecuting cases based primarily on community gossip and speculation. But prosecutors led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Harrison had spent months building their case with the help of the Cold Justice team. They had phone records showing the precise timing of calls between the defendants, witness testimony about their suspicious behavior before and after the murder, and expert analysis of the crime scene that supported their theory of how the killing had been carried out. Most importantly, they had a coherent narrative that explained not just what happened, but why it happened, and how the conspirators had tried to cover their tracks. The prosecution's case was built on the foundation of circumstantial evidence, but as experienced prosecutors know, circumstantial evidence can be more powerful than direct evidence when it creates an overwhelming pattern that points to only one logical conclusion. And in the Van der Zee case, every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Collins and Viscosill had conspired to murder David Van der Zee for money and love. Harrison's prosecutorial strategy was methodical and comprehensive. He planned to call dozens of witnesses, including community members who'd observed Collins and Viscosill's inappropriate relationship during David's brief marriage, phone company representatives who would explain the significance of the call patterns on September 23, 2003, and expert witnesses who would testify about the crime scene evidence and ballistics analysis. The prosecution also planned to call Janie Dunham, Viscosill's former girlfriend, whose testimony about his suspicious behavior on the night of the murder and his intimate relationship with Collins would be crucial to establishing motive and opportunity. Dunham's recollections of finding Viscosill and Collins holding hands the morning after David's murder would be particularly damaging to the defense's claim of innocent friendship, and her testimony about the affair would help establish the romantic motive for the killing. Kelly, Siegler, and members of the Cold Justice team would also testify about their investigation and their analysis of the evidence. Ziegler's reputation as a prosecutor who'd won hundreds of cases and helped solve dozens of cold cases would lend tremendous credibility to the prosecution's theory of how and why the murder had been committed, and her ability to present complex circumstantial evidence to juries in compelling ways would be crucial to securing convictions. As the trial date approached in the fall of 2025, media attention intensified dramatically. The case had captured national attention because of its connection to cold justice, and because it represented one of the oldest cold cases ever successfully prosecuted in Wisconsin. True crime enthusiasts followed every development on social media. Podcasters analyzed every court filing, and the quiet community of Powers Lake found itself at the center of an unprecedented media circus. The Oxygen Network planned to air special episodes documenting the investigation and prosecution. Kelly Siegler gave interviews to major news outlets, explaining how modern investigative techniques had been used to solve a decades-old case. and legal experts appeared on television, debating whether prosecutors had sufficient evidence to convince a jury to convict based on circumstantial evidence alone. The case became a touchstone for discussions about cold case investigations, the role of television in solving crimes, and the challenges of prosecuting decades-old murders. Major news networks sent correspondents to Powers Lake to cover the story. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and local television stations set up remote broadcasts from the shores of the lake where David had lived and died. Reporters interviewed longtime residents about their memories of the murder and their reactions to the arrests, creating a media frenzy that transformed the quiet lakeside community into the center of a national conversation about justice delayed. True crime podcasters descended on Kenosha County, conducting their own interviews with community members, analyzing court documents, and providing running commentary on every development in the case. Popular shows like My Favorite Murder, Crime Junkie, and True Crime Garage devoted episodes to the Vanderzee case, bringing even more attention to the prosecution and increasing pressure on both the defense and prosecution teams. David Vanderzee's family members, led by his brother Tim, prepared to attend every day of what promised to be a lengthy and emotionally difficult trial. They'd waited over 20 years for this moment, and they were determined to see justice served regardless of how painful the proceedings might be. The family had endured 2 decades of wondering, of seeing the suspected killers live freely in their community, and now they finally had the chance to hear the truth told in a court of law. David deserves his day in court, Tim Vanderzee said in an emotional interview with local television news. He deserves to have the truth told about what happened to him, about how he was betrayed by the 2 people he trusted most, about how his life was cut short by greed and selfishness. If we have to sit through every day of testimony to make sure his story is heard, that's what we'll do. We owe him that much, after all these years. The family's pain was evident in every interview, every court appearance, every public statement. They'd lived for over 2 decades, knowing that David's killers were likely living freely, possibly even prospering, while their loved one lay in his grave. The arrests had brought relief, but also a renewed sense of grief as they prepared to relive the worst moments of their lives in front of cameras and strangers. David's elderly mother, now 91 years old, had spent the better part of 2 decades making regular visits to the Kenosha County Sheriff's Office, bringing homemade cookies and gentle reminders that her son's case should not be forgotten. She'd lived to see the arrests, but her advanced age and failing health raised questions about whether she'd live to see the final resolution of the case that had consumed so much of her later life. The trial was scheduled to begin in early 2026, giving both sides time to prepare their cases and complete witness interviews. But legal observers predicted the proceedings could last several months, given the complexity of the evidence and the number of witnesses expected to testify. The judge would need to manage not only the legal proceedings, but also the media circus surrounding the case, ensuring that the defendants received fair trials while allowing appropriate public access to the proceedings. Jury selection would be particularly challenging. Finding 12 people who hadn't been influenced by the extensive media coverage of the case would be difficult in an era of social media and true crime entertainment. Both sides would likely spend considerable time questioning potential jurors about their knowledge of the case, their exposure to television coverage, their opinions about circumstantial evidence, and their ability to evaluate complex timelines and phone records fairly. The defense teams faced enormous challenges, not just from the strength of the prosecution's evidence, but from public opinion that had largely turned against their clients. Decades of community suspicion had created a narrative in which Collins and Viscasil were widely believed to be guilty, and overcoming that presumption would require masterful legal work and perhaps a change of venue to find impartial jurors. If convicted, both Collins and Viscasil faced mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole. Wisconsin law required life imprisonment for first-degree intentional homicide, and the advanced age of the defendants would effectively mean they would die in prison. The stakes could not have been higher for two people who'd already lived most of their lives in freedom while their victim lay in his grave. The irony was not lost on observers that they might spend their final years behind bars after decades of freedom. The case also raised broader questions about the statute of limitations for murder, the role of media in solving crimes, and the challenges of prosecuting cases where the primary evidence was decades old. Legal experts debated whether it was fair to prosecute people for crimes committed over 20 years earlier, whether witness memories could be trusted after so much time, and whether the involvement of television producers in the investigation had compromised the integrity of the evidence. As 2025 drew to a close, the David Vanderzee murder case represented both a triumph of persistence and a reminder of how justice delayed can still be justice served. The cold justice team had accomplished what seemed impossible, breathing new life into a cold case that had frustrated investigators for over 2 decades, proving that even the most challenging cases could be solved with fresh perspectives, modern techniques, and unwavering determination. The case also highlighted the evolution of investigative techniques over the past 2 decades. Phone records that seemed less significant in 2003 became crucial evidence when analyzed with modern understanding of communication patterns and criminal behavior. Witness testimony that had been overlooked or undervalued during the original investigation proved to be the key to understanding the conspiracy. And television resources provided tools and expertise that local law enforcement couldn't access on their own. For the law enforcement community, the Vanderzee case became a testament to the importance of never giving up on unsolved murders. Detective Neil Paulson, who'd worked the case during its early years before retiring, expressed satisfaction that his instincts about Collins and Viscasil had been vindicated, even though it took more than 2 decades for the evidence to catch up with his suspicions. His persistence in maintaining detailed case files and his willingness to work with the cold justice team had been crucial to the eventual breakthrough. "I always believed they were guilty," Paulson said in a reflective interview, "but believing and proving are 2 different things." It took the fresh perspective of the cold justice team and advances in investigative techniques to finally build a case strong enough to prosecute. But David's family never gave up hope, and neither did we. That persistence, that refusal to let the case die, that's what ultimately led to justice. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond Powers Lake and Kenosha County. Cold case units across the country took notice of the techniques used to solve the Vanderzee murder. The collaboration between local law enforcement and national television resources created a model that other jurisdictions began adopting for their own unsolved cases. Requests for cold justice assistance increased dramatically as other communities sought similar breakthroughs in their own forgotten murders. Television shows like Cold Justice had proven their value in solving real crimes, not just entertaining audiences. The resources they brought to investigations, including expert analysis, advanced forensic techniques, fresh investigative approaches, and national publicity, had tangible benefits for families seeking justice and communities seeking closure. The success of the Vanderzee case demonstrated that entertainment and justice could work together effectively when handled with appropriate professionalism and respect for victims. Families, as John Viscasil sat in his jail cell through the long months of preparation, and Roxana Collins tried to live a normal life while out on bail, both faced the reality that their decades-long secret was finally public. The elaborate lies they'd constructed to cover their crime were being dissected by prosecutors and exposed to public scrutiny. Their reputations in the community where they'd lived for years were permanently destroyed, and their legacy would be defined by their alleged role in David's murder. For Collins, living under house arrest conditions while out on bail, the weight of public attention was overwhelming everywhere she went. People recognized her as the woman accused of murdering her husband. Former friends and neighbors avoided her. Reporters tried to interview her. And the stress of maintaining innocence while preparing for a trial that could result in life imprisonment took a visible toll on her health and appearance. The people of Powers Lake, who'd suspected Collins and Viscasil for over 20 years, felt vindicated but also saddened by the confirmation of what they'd long believed. David Vanderzee had been betrayed and murdered by the two people who should have protected and cared for him. His wife and his best friend had conspired to end his life for money and passion, then lived freely while his family suffered without answers. The community's long-held suspicions had been proven correct, but there was no satisfaction in being right about something so terrible. For true crime enthusiasts following the case across the country and around the world, the Vanderzee murder represented the best of what cold case investigation could accomplish: patient detective work, advanced forensic analysis, fresh perspectives, and unwavering commitment to justice had combined to solve a puzzle that had seemed impossible to crack. The case became a symbol of hope for other families with unsolved murders, proof that time didn't always protect killers from the consequences of their actions. The case also served as a warning to criminals who thought they'd gotten away with murder. Advances in technology, changes in investigative techniques, and the dedication of cold case units meant that even decades-old crimes could still be solved. There was no statute of limitations on murder, and there was no guarantee that time alone would provide safety from prosecution. The message was clear: justice might be delayed, but it would never be denied as long as dedicated investigators and grieving families refused to give up. As the legal proceedings continued into 2026, the ghost of David Vanderzee finally seemed to be finding the peace that had been denied him for over 2 decades. His killers had been identified, arrested, and would face justice in a court of law. His family had answers to the questions that had tormented them for 21 years, and his community could finally begin to heal from the trauma of unsolved murder that had haunted them for so long. The final chapter of the David Vanderzee story would be written in a Kenosha County courtroom, where 12 jurors would decide whether Collins and Viscasil were guilty of the calculated, cold-blooded murder of a trusting man who'd made the fatal mistake of loving his wife and trusting his best friend. But regardless of the trial's outcome, the case had already achieved something remarkable. It had proven that justice, however delayed, could still be served, and that the truth, however long buried, could still emerge to provide closure for those who'd never stopped seeking it. David Allen Vanderzee had been dead for over 21 years. But his case lived on as a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up on unsolved crimes, and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. His legacy would be remembered not just as the victim of a heinous murder, but as the catalyst for an investigation that showed the world that no killer, no matter how clever or patient, could escape justice forever. His story would inspire other families to never give up hope, other investigators to never close the books on unsolved cases, and other communities to never stop seeking the truth about the crimes that had torn them apart. In the end, David Vanderzee's murder case became more than just a story about betrayal and justice delayed. It became a symbol of what was possible when determination met opportunity, when fresh eyes examined old evidence, when families refused to let their loved ones be forgotten, and when communities demanded answers to the questions that haunted them. The case proved that evil might triumph temporarily, but truth and justice, when pursued with enough persistence and dedication, would ultimately prevail. In the end, David Vanderzee's murder case became more than just a story about betrayal and justice delayed. It became a symbol of what was possible when determination met opportunity. When fresh eyes examined old evidence, when families refused to let their loved ones be forgotten, and when communities demanded answers to the questions that haunted them. The case proved that evil might triumph temporarily, but truth and justice, when pursued with enough persistence and dedication, would ultimately prevail. The impact of David's case extended far beyond the borders of Wisconsin, becoming a touchstone for cold case investigators across the nation and around the world. Law enforcement agencies from California to New York, from Canada to Australia, reached out to learn about the techniques that had finally cracked a case that seemed hopeless. The Vanderzee investigation became required study material for cold case units, a textbook example of how patience, persistence, and innovative approaches could solve even the most challenging murders. Police academies began incorporating the Vanderzee case into their curricula, using it to teach future investigators about the importance of maintaining detailed case files, preserving evidence properly, and never closing the books on unsolved murders. The case demonstrated that even when traditional investigative methods failed, new approaches and fresh perspectives could still yield results decades later. The collaboration between the cold justice team and local law enforcement created a new model for solving cold cases, proving that entertainment resources could be harnessed for genuine investigative purposes when handled with appropriate professionalism and respect for victims' families. Other television shows began following the cold justice model, creating a new genre of reality television that prioritized solving crimes over pure entertainment. Victim advocacy groups embraced David's case as an example of why families should never give up hope. His story became a rallying cry for persistence in the face of seemingly hopeless circumstances. Speaking engagements by Tim Vanderzee and other family members inspired other families to continue fighting for justice, even when years or decades had passed without progress. The case also had significant impact on legal and academic communities. Law schools began using the Vanderzee prosecution as a case study in circumstantial evidence, demonstrating how skilled prosecutors could build compelling cases without direct evidence. The phone records analysis became a template for other cases involving complex communication patterns and timing evidence. Forensic science programs incorporated lessons from the case into their training, showing students how evidence preservation techniques from decades past could still yield crucial information when analyzed with modern methods. The case demonstrated the importance of maintaining chain of custody and proper storage procedures, even when the immediate value of evidence wasn't apparent. The media coverage of the case also changed how true crime stories were told. The extensive social media involvement and real-time analysis created new standards for public engagement with criminal cases. But it also raised important questions about the balance between public interest and fair trial, rights that would influence coverage of future cases. Digital. Forensics experts noted that the Vanderzee case showed how communication records that seemed routine at the time could become crucial evidence years later. The phone records from September 23, 2003, had been preserved and ultimately provided the key to understanding the conspiracy, demonstrating the importance of preserving digital evidence, even when its immediate relevance wasn't clear. Psychology. Researchers studied the case as an example of how people could maintain deceptive relationships for decades. The way Collins and Viscasil had hidden their guilt while living in the community where their victim had died fascinated experts in criminal psychology and deceptive behavior. Their ability to compartmentalize their crime while maintaining apparently normal lives became a subject of academic study. The case also influenced policy discussions about bail and pretrial detention, Collins's ability to post substantial bail while facing life imprisonment charges sparked debates about whether alleged murderers should ever be released pending trial, especially in cases involving decades of successful evasion of justice. Community leaders in Powers Lake worked to ensure that the long-term impact of the case would be positive. They established a memorial fund in David's name to support other families dealing with unsolved murders, created educational programs about domestic violence and relationship abuse, and worked with law enforcement to improve communication with families during long-term investigations. The economic impact on Powers Lake was complex and long-lasting. While the initial media circus brought temporary business to local establishments, the association with murder created ongoing challenges for tourism and property values. Community leaders worked to balance honoring David's memory with moving beyond the notoriety that the case had brought to their quiet lakeside town. Local schools incorporated lessons from the case into their social studies and criminal justice programs, using David's story to teach students about the importance of the justice system, the role of evidence in criminal prosecutions, and the ways that communities can work together to solve problems. The case became a living example of how persistence and community involvement could achieve results. Religious communities in the area used David's story as an example of faith and perseverance. His mother's decades-long vigil, bringing cookies to detectives and never giving up hope, became a symbol of unwavering faith in ultimate justice. Churches across Wisconsin shared her story as an inspiration for members facing their own long-term challenges. The case influenced legislation in Wisconsin and other states regarding victim rights, cold case funding, and law enforcement resources for unsolved murders. Lawmakers cited David's case when proposing increased funding for DNA testing, expanded victim services, and specialized cold case units. His death became a catalyst for systematic improvements in how unsolved murders were handled. International law enforcement agencies studied the case as an example of how media partnerships could enhance investigative capabilities. The success of the Cold Justice collaboration inspired similar programs in other countries, where television resources were combined with police work to solve long-dormant cases. Mental health professionals noted the case's demonstration of how unsolved crimes affected entire communities, not just immediate family members. The decades of uncertainty and suspicion in Powers Lake showed how murder could create lasting trauma that affected everyone who lived with unanswered questions. The eventual resolution provided a form of community healing that had important implications for victim services. The case also became significant in discussions about the death penalty. As Wisconsin had abolished capital punishment, Collins and Viscasil faced life imprisonment rather than execution if convicted. This aspect of the case was studied by criminologists, interested in the deterrent effects of different penalties and the impact of sentence structure on prosecution decisions. Technology companies noted how the case demonstrated the long-term value of communication records. The phone data that proved crucial to the prosecution had been stored for over 2 decades, showing the importance of data retention, policies, and the potential future value of information that might seem routine at the time it was generated. Social media researchers studied how the case had played out online, with millions of people following developments in real time, sharing theories and discussing evidence. The Vanderzee case became one of the first major criminal cases to unfold entirely in the social media age, creating new dynamics between public opinion and legal proceedings. The influence on popular culture was equally significant. The case inspired novels, television dramas, and documentary films. David's story became part of the broader cultural conversation about justice, betrayal, and the importance of never giving up hope. His name became synonymous with the idea that no murder would remain unsolved forever. Educational institutions created scholarship programs in David's name, supporting students studying criminal justice, forensic science, and victim advocacy. These programs ensured that his legacy would continue to influence future generations of professionals working in law enforcement and victim services. The case also had unexpected influence on relationship counseling and domestic violence prevention programs. The pattern of deception and betrayal that had led to David's murder became a teaching example for recognizing warning signs in relationships, helping others avoid similar tragedies through education and awareness. Child protection advocates noted how the case demonstrated the importance of thorough background checks and investigation techniques. The methods used to uncover Collins and Viscasill's deception could be applied to other situations where vulnerable people needed protection from those who might harm them. Financial crime investigators studied the case for insights into how murderers might benefit economically from their crimes. Collins's inheritance of David's assets became a template for investigating other cases where financial gain might be a motive for violence. The case showed how financial records could provide crucial evidence in murder prosecutions. As the years passed and the case moved through the legal system, David's story continued to inspire and influence people around the world. His murder had been a tragedy, but his legacy became a force for positive change in law enforcement, victim advocacy, and community support systems. The transformation of a quiet Navy veteran's murder into a catalyst for justice reform, investigative innovation, and community healing demonstrated the profound impact that one person's story could have on the world. David Van Der Zee had been betrayed and murdered by those closest to him, but his death had ultimately led to improvements in how society dealt with similar crimes and supported other victims' families. His mother's decades of bringing cookies to detectives became a symbol of maternal love and determination that inspired people facing their own challenges. Her refusal to let her son be forgotten showed the power of persistent advocacy and the importance of keeping pressure on systems that might otherwise move on to newer cases. The case proved that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied, that communities could heal from trauma when truth was finally revealed, and that the work of dedicated investigators and prosecutors could achieve results even in the most challenging circumstances. David's legacy lived on in every cold case that was solved, every family that found closure, and every community that refused to give up on seeking truth. In death, David Van Der Zee had become more than a victim. He had become a symbol of hope for justice, a reminder that no crime was too old to solve, and an inspiration for anyone who refused to accept that evil could triumph permanently. His story would continue to influence investigations, inspire families, and remind communities that the pursuit of truth and justice was always worthwhile, no matter how long it might take. The final truth about David Van Der Zee was that while his life had been cut short by betrayal and greed, his death had ultimately served a greater purpose, bringing justice not only for himself, but inspiring improvements in how society dealt with murder, supported victim families, and refused to let killers escape the consequences of their actions. His legacy would live forever in the lives he touched and the changes his case had inspired. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.